How many people, I guess I should introduce myself first. For those of you who don't know me, and I think I know some of you here, my name is Gabrielle Langley, and I'm a licensed mental health provider. I've worked in the Jewish community for the past 25 plus years. I am also a poet. I have 2 books of poetry out. And the most recent one that I did is a study on grief and loss and how we preserve a sense of magic and joy even in the face of great grief and loss. So what I want to do today is very quickly look at the 2 theoretical frameworks of grief and loss. And then I want to move on to some poetry, some of the traditions in modern poetry, and talk about how they are how poetry is uniquely positioned to respond to issues of grief and loss and burden and hard times. Who here, not to put anybody on the spot, but who else here is a poet? Anybody here write poetry? 2 people are they're being shy, but I see who you are. So, there's another, we poets are kind of shy, I notice. But it's good to know that I have a few colleagues in the audience. And how many of you read poetry on a relatively regular basis? Okay, wonderful. So looking at it, the grief and loss, the 2 biggest theoretical models, the ones that are used most by grief counselors, therapists, psychologists, that probably the 2 most popular, the one most popular is the Kubler-Ross model, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that one. That's talks about when denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Everybody's nodding now. We've heard of that. So it's really important to understand that in that model, when Kubler-Ross first brought it out, she said, oh, well, everybody goes through these phases. These were distinct steps that people went through. And as we've done the research over decades, we realized that there's nothing so neat and tidy and predictable about grief and loss. And any of you who have experienced profound grief and loss, you know this. These feelings they change shape, they move in and out. You can think, oh, you dealt with all of my anger about my loss, and then it can come back and bite you. And probably the reason we think this is it is the psyche's way of protecting us from experiencing these things all at once. Because if we experienced all these emotions at once, we would probably be unable to conduct basic, necessary activities of daily life. We would be absolutely on the floor. The other theoretical model I want to look at or touch on is one by Worden, and it's called The 4 Tasks of Grieving. I actually have found this to have more utility in the clinical work that I've done with families. And I like this better because unlike the Kubler-Ross model, which has this idea that you're going to just be passively there experiencing these feelings, Worden comes and he says, well, you got all these overwhelming feelings, but the griever has 4 tasks that they need to accomplish. And the first task is to acknowledge the reality of the loss. And so right after you get the information that the loss has occurred, and this can be any loss, it can be an actual physical death, it could be the loss of a job, it could be the loss of a scholarship, it could be the loss of a partner, a husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, it could be the loss of a family member, a good friend, any kind of significant loss. It could be the loss of your home. Initially, when it happens, there is often a sense of shock and disbelief and disorientation. And one of the first poems that I'm going to look at is called Kaddish by Allen Ginsberg, which deals with that sense of disorientation. again, this is probably the psyche's way of protecting us from being totally overwhelmed. Sometimes if we feel some denial, like, oh, this isn't really happening, it enables us to metabolize the feeling of grief as it comes up in waves. Grief will tend to come up in waves, and it tends to come up, if it came up all at once, again, we would probably not be able to function at all. The second one is the task of to move through the pain of grief. That is sometimes the hardest thing to do. That is the really raw gut punch feeling, the sobbing, the feeling completely bereft. And that's where you're not in denial at that point. Those feelings are actually coming up and being metabolized. And that can be very, very disorienting as well. The third is adjusting to an environment in which the loss has occurred. So not only, I talk about we don't want to be so overwhelmed with emotion that we're paralyzed, because there are a lot of things that still have to go on. I mean, for example, if you lose your spouse, a lot of times you have to answer the questions. Those of you who have lost a spouse realize that that spouse probably did a lot of things that you weren't even really conscious of, or you may have been conscious of it, but you didn't know exactly how they did it. If you have a spouse become ill, and you suddenly have to figure out how to manage their checking account, for example. Maybe you kept separate checking accounts. So this is, when we talk about the environment in which the loss has occurred, there are a lot of other things changing. So in addition, as if dealing with all those feelings weren't enough, you've got to also figure out, what do we do now that this loss has occurred? If it's a loss, and again, it doesn't have to be a loss of a person, it can also be the loss of a home. It can be those of us who went through Hurricane Harvey, lost homes. The facility that I've worked with for many years, we lost the entire first floor of the facility where I work, and that was really quite devastating. So keep that in mind. Just because you haven't lost a family member does not mean you don't understand what grief and loss is about. And then finally, Worden says the fourth task, and critically important task, is that the mourner has to psychologically relocate the loss and reinvest in living. So that bears repeating. Psychologically relocate the loss and reinvest in living. Now, what Worden is not saying is that relocating it means you pretend it didn't happen. That's not what he's saying. It means that the loss is not right up here in the front of your, right up here in your face all the time. And that you find that you're able to do things like set aside, you're not thinking about it constantly. It's not constantly on your mind. Yes, you'll still think about it. Yes, you'll still experience sadness or different emotions at times, but it's not as acute. You're not in the acute phase of grief and loss. So what does any of this have to do with poetry? Well, I'm going to maintain that what modernism brought to poetry is the ability to process, or the ability to express grief and loss in a way that the heart and the soul understand. And it did this a lot because poets were really rebelling at the beginning of the last century. They were really rebelling against Victorian poetry, which had become very moralizing and very tidy and it had a very kind of syrupy voice. It was very predictable. It had very predictable rhyme schemes. The meter was very predictable. It would follow these little rules. And it became, with all due respect, there were some great poets during the Victorian era, but it degenerated into things that were just being repeated over and over and over again. So the modernist poets like T.S. Eliot, who came in with The Wasteland, And of course, one of his favorite, one of the great lines in all of poetry, when he says, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dark earth." And he's writing in stream of consciousness. And he's also taking this image, which one of the Victorian poets would have made very flowery. And he's saying lilacs, but he's saying, what's awful is that the speaker of the poem in the Wastelands is saying, I am so grief-stricken, and how can April come and be bringing these beautiful flowers? Because I'm grief-stricken, and how do flowers bloom how do flowers come out of this dark earth? And it raises a really profound question. And he's also doing it in a way that's a bit jarring. This is not a part of a poem that has little rhythms and rhymes, and it's not cute, it's not pretty, it's not sentimental. So there's a lot of rejection of some old Victorian tropes, and there's a lot of acceptance in modernist poetry of what were before considered unacceptable emotions. So instead of just, being socially acceptable, they began to look at emotions that as a source of inspiration, and also psychological confusion as a source of inspiration. So you don't have to have the answers to everything to sit down and write a poem. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes that we see with poets that are first starting out is that they have a tendency to want to moralize everything, and they'll tend to put, and I've been guilty of this myself. It took me a long time to break the habit of doing that. You tend to want to write, and they'll usually do it in the last 2 lines, and you'll tend to write, okay, and the moral of the story is, you should be feeling this and you shouldn't be feeling that, or something like that. And a lot of times going and just erasing that out of the poem will give you a much stronger poem. So if you are writing poetry, experiment with that a little bit, because I promise you a lot of times we do not need that last line or 2 lines in there. You don't need to tidy it all up. It's okay to let it be what it is, to be a reflection of humanity, to not give the answer. The other thing that happened is, and this really cannot be overstated in terms of modern poetry, World War I absolutely transformed poetry. And what it did was, it was a shocking event. Even though modernism in art and literature had started earlier, World War I accelerates it. So it is in Europe. These people are seeing a war the likes of which no one has seen before, and you have an entire continent that is just in a state of massive grief, massive shock. Many of the young men have been lost, or if they do come back, they come back physically and or psychologically wounded, extremely wounded after those battlefield experiences. And you have Dadaism, and then you have the surreal in the art, in visual arts, and this goes on from about 1916 through about the mid-1920s. You also have, for the first time, stream of consciousness in poetry. And that's really exciting because for the first time, we're going inside the mind. It is uniquely, stream of consciousness poetry gives you an ability to experience how fragmented emotions like grief and loss or like post-traumatic stress disorder can be. It fractures the inside of the mind. It shakes it up. And I see some people nodding like they're so I know you, as humans, we tend to understand what this means. It also starts breaking off with rhyme. Let's go with rhyme. It starts, and it begins to, in addition to capturing interior thought patterns, it starts rejecting rhyme, rejecting reason. It brings in a lot of surreal imagery, it was really riveting the attention of the reader if you're reading carefully. So modern poetry really liberates expression, and it captures, maybe for the first time, that interior pattern of unpredictable thought and emotion that we experience when we've lost something. So let's look at I'm going to read a very early example, and I've provided copies of these with you. I don't know that we'll be able to read all of them today, but hopefully we will. So this is a poet named Thomas Hardy. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. Pretty famous. He's an example of a modernist poet, but he was really early, and I'm going to call him a transitional poet. He was circa 1912. And he's writing this poem, which I'm going to read, and I want you to look at how he's still using rhyme, but he is talking about the loss of his wife, and I want you to see how he begins to dissolve in the final stanza. And he starts breaking his own rules, so he's losing his structure, which is reflecting his grief as he is contemplating the loss of his wife. And it's called The Voice. Woman, much missed, how you call to me, saying that now you are not as you were, when you had changed from the one who was all to me, but as at first, when our day was fair. Can it be you that I hear? Let me view you then, standing as when I drew near to the town, where you would wait for me. Yes, as I knew you then, even to the original air blue gown. Or is it only the breeze in its listlessness, traveling across the wet mead to me here, you being ever dissolved to a wan wistlessness, heard no more again, far or near? Thus I, faltering forward, leaves around me falling, wind oozing thin through the thorn from norward, and the woman calling. And I've listed on all of these poems, I've listed the source, and this is available in the public domain at Poetry Foundation. And that's the link. If you type that link in there, you can get to this poem. And then moving ahead, about quite a ways ahead, we're going into this poem. Was written in the mid to late 1950s, and it's by the amazing poet Allen Ginsberg. Some of you know him from his famous poem Howl. And this is his poem called Kaddish. It's written for his mother, who died in 1956, and her name was Naomi Ginsberg. And as I read this, I want you to listen for that sense of absolute disorientation and all of the flooding thoughts that are coming in, all of the things that he's dealing with and thinking about as he's trying to adjust to this environment where his mother is suddenly no longer there. And a lot of critics will also tell you that he is, and Ginsberg himself said this, that not only was he grieving the loss of his mother, but he was grieving the loss of his Judaism, of his religion, and how his mother really carried that. And he had fallen very far away from it as he grew up and became this very avant-garde poet and living in San Francisco and breaking all of these social rules. So he comes back, he is reaching back to his Judaism, and just the poem, its title, Kaddish, tells us a lot. Strange now to think of you, gone, without corsets and eyes, while I walk on the sunny pavement of Greenwich Village, downtown Manhattan, clear winter noon, And I've been up all night talking, reading the Kaddish aloud, listening to Ray Charles blues shout blind on the phonograph. The rhythm, and your memory in my head after 3 years after, and read Adonai's last triumphant stanzas aloud, wept, realizing how we suffer, and how death is that remedy all singers dream of. Sing, remember, prophecy, as in the Hebrew anthem, or the Buddhist book of answers, and my own imagination of a withered leaf at dawn. Dreaming back through life, your time and mine accelerating toward apocalypse, the final moment, the flower burning in the day, and what comes after, looking back on the mind itself that saw an American city a flash away. And the great dream of me or China or you and a phantom Russia or a crumpled bed that never existed, like a poem in the dark, escaped back to oblivion, no more to say, and nothing to weep for, but the beings in the dream trapped in its disappearance, sighing, screaming with it, buying and selling pieces of phantom, worshiping each other, worshiping the God included in it all, longing or inevitability while it lasts, a vision, anything more. It leaps about me as I go out and walk the street, look back over my shoulder, 7th Avenue, the battlements of window offices, buildings shouldering each other high under a cloud, tall as the sky, an instant, and the sky above, an old blue place, or down to the avenue to the south, to, as I walk toward the Lower East Side, where you walked 50 years ago, little girl from Russia, eating the first poisonous tomatoes of America, frightened on the dock, then struggling in the crowds of Orchard Street toward what? Toward Newark? Toward candy store? First homemade sodas of the century, hand-churned ice cream in back room on musty brown floorboards? Toward education? Marriage, nervous breakdown, operation, teaching school, and learning to be mad in a dream. What is this life? And that poem, this is only a section of that poem. This poem is really quite, we would be here almost all afternoon if I read all of it to you, but I did want to bring at least part of it in because I really feel like it captures so much of what the experience of losing somebody that you love is like. You know, you can really, especially in the second part of this first section here, he's walking and all of these thoughts are just popping into his head, and it's so beautiful how he captures that. It's really, to me, it's really astonishing. He's, and you know, him suddenly seeing his mother coming from Russia as a little girl, and then he'll jump and break that thought pattern into the, you know, the poisonous tomatoes of America, and then he jumps back to her being frightened on the dock. So there's he really is showing the brain's ability to jump back and forth. And he's trying, you really can hear him trying to make sense out of this new world in which his mother is no longer a part. And he's reaching for her, and he is also reaching for his faith, for his religion. This next poem, did anybody have any questions about that one? Does anybody? Okay, I don't want to jump over it. If anybody is wondering anything, this next one is by the great Yehuda Amichai. He is one of Israel's, probably, and some people will say he is Israel's greatest poet. He unfortunately is not with us anymore. And this is a poem that he wrote. It's called "My Mother on Her Sick Bed." My mother on her sick bed, with the lightness and hollowness of a person who has already said goodbye at an airport in the beautiful and quiet area between parting and takeoff. My mother on her sick bed, all she had in life is now like empty bottles in front of the door that will show once more with colored labels what filled them with joy and sadness. In her last words, "Take the flowers out of the room," she said 7 days before her death. Then she closed her eyes for 7 days, like the 7 days of mourning. But even her death created in her room a warm hominess. With her sleeping face and the cup with its teaspoon and the towel and the book and the glasses and her hand on the blanket, the same hand that felt my forehead in childhood. So that to me is just a really stunning, it captures a really stunning image of the last few days. And I love how he almost, when he repeats the 7 days, 7 days, 7 days, there's something very, when a poet does that, it can capture, a lot of times it gives you a sense of being in a trance. It's repetition tends to do that with poetry. And keep in mind too, that with poetry, it really wasn't until the 1500s that poetry was ever separated from music. And prior to that time, all poems were written as lyrics of songs. They were written as to be sung or said with background instrument. So even you think about the great Greek poet Sappho, her work was written, this is just one of many examples. And the reason that poetry was rhyming, it was so that the troubadours, when they were going from town to town and entertaining people, it was so they could remember. This was before, keep in mind, this is before the printing press. So, and also a lot of the performers were not necessarily literate. So they're learning these songs, and the rhymes help them to remember the songs as they're going from place to place to place. So it's interesting to see what happens with when you see something, a musical device that is still existing in poetry, for example, refrain or repetition, and it does have that ability to kind of sometimes lull us a bit into a sense of trance. And keep in mind that that is very much, no matter how modern and fractured our poetry becomes, we still owe a great debt to its link with music. This next one is by an amazing poet. She's hard to, I don't even know how to describe her. I would encourage you, if you love poetry, to really go and look for her books. She does incredible things with imagery and plucking imagery out and showing instead of telling. One of the golden rules of poetry is to show, not tell. Because when you're showing, when you're using imagery, you're inviting the other person, the reader or the listener, to enter with their imagination. I had, right before I came in here, I had an amazing, brief but amazing conversation with another presenter here who is doing his presentation on shadow puppetry. And we were talking about how both poetry and then with shadow puppetry, that you're leaving certain things out and you're trusting that the imagination of the viewer or the reader or the listener is able to fill in with their imagination. So notice when you are seeing a poem, particularly something that has more white space like this, and by white space I literally mean the white space that's surrounding the stanzas and the lines. And Louise Gluck tends to leave a lot of white space. She tends to write it with that kind of compression. This one is called The Wild Iris. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. Hear me out. That which you call death, I remember. Overhead, noises, branches, in the pine shifting, then nothing. The weak sun flickered over the dry surface. It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth. Then it was over. That which you fear being, a soul and unable to speak, ending abruptly, the stiff earth bending a little, and what I took to be birds darting in low shrubs. You who do not remember, passage from the other world. I tell you I could speak again. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. From the center of my life came a great fountain, deep blue, shadows on azure seawater. And if you'll flip back to the beginning of that poem, this poem is wonderfully abstract, wonderfully imagistic, but I want to be able to unpack it a little bit. Can anybody tell me what are they picking up from this poem? What is it saying? And there's no right or wrong answer, I promise you. Anybody have any observation about what's happening in the wild iris? The life cycle. Yes, exactly. Life and death, and then rebirth. The iris, is coming back again. Who is speaking? Who is the narrator here? The what? The bereaved yeah, the person is bereaved, but Louise Gluck is showing us she's actually speaking through an inanimate, not inanimate object, but she's speaking through a non-human voice. She's given voice to the iris itself, to the bulb. And this is really fascinating because a lot of times when you're reading poetry, and particularly if it's starting to feel abstract or starting to feel remote, a lot of times, of course, you do need to reread it. But ask yourself who is speaking in the poem, because it's not always going to be the poet. Certainly it is the case with Allen Ginsberg. He's in Kaddish. He is speaking. He, the poet, is speaking, and the same with Yehuda Amichai. But Louise Gluck is doing something even more. I would argue more imaginative. She's giving voice to a bulb, an iris bulb, and the bulb is speaking to us. It's saying, it's kind of terrible to survive as consciousness, and it's talking about being conscious of being under the dark earth, and which is a really chilling, she's taking us to a really chilling place, like, oh my gosh, this is something that's been buried and is supposedly dead, and this thing is conscious that it's dead. I mean, would be a terrifying experience. And yet what she does with it, when she, like you say, the cycle of life, when she brings this thing, the poet brings her back, which is what nature does. And she comes back, this beautiful iris comes back as this great fountain, this deep blue shadows in azure sea water in that final stanza. So it's really about the cycle of life and death. And it is about acknowledging the fearfulness and the terror and the awe of it, but at the same time, the great beauty of continuity that happens. And I think, too, you could make an argument when you look back on Warden's 4 tasks that Louise Gluck is in that point of psychologically relocating a loss and reinvesting in living, sort of realizing there is going to be beauty after loss. There is going to be beauty after death. You may, in the initial phases, feel like you've lost everything and you will never know a full experience of joy again. And yet, time heals all wounds. It's like somebody who's here today that I know was quoting, was it Tom Hanks? Who said, time is my ally. And what did he says? Time is my ally and is your ally? Yeah. And it really reminds us that the process of grief, as painful as it is, that grief is really, that process is nature's way of healing a broken heart and allowing us to keep going. Okay, we have a few more minutes. So I did bring, because I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about process and talk about going back to Warden's 4 tasks of grieving. I did bring and gave you as lagniappe 3 of the poems out of, this is my latest book that has just come out, and it's called Fairy Tale. It's really a study of how we protect magic and joy even in the face of great grief and loss. And it looks at, the book is looking at a lot of different types of grief and loss and also danger. And it looks at it on a global level, but at a more personal scale. I was doing an exploration of it after I learned about my brother's diagnosis with a stage 4 cancer. And I want to read the first poem that I wrote right after I got that news. And it's called Going Halves. When my brother tells me his diagnosis, my own brain unfolds like a red Swiss Army knife. This comes from a quarter century working in healthcare, learning which tool fits into what problem. Most important, I extract the longest blade, cut my own heart like a small apple. I slice it lengthwise. I give him half. And this next poem is written, this is actually written to my sister-in-law, and I was observing her after the news of that we received about my brother's diagnosis and prognosis. And it's called After the News. She remains small and smooth, a deep blue stone, black eyelashes, balance, a pinpoint diamond. I know this dance, the one where everyone sings. She is so strong. Her hands extend, her palms upturned. See how carefully she is holding shards of glass. And then the third one I'll read from this book is called Respiration in 100 Words or Less. And this was written after the loss has occurred. If any of you have had a loved one or you yourselves have had a diagnosis of cancer, you realize that initially it is absolutely shocking when you hear, especially if it's a really, really malignant, aggressive form. But amazingly, miraculously, you learn that in spite of the devastation, that you can psychologically relocate that loss, and you begin to do other things, you know. And so in this part, this was written almost a year later, as I began to see my family doing better, and my brother having a quality of life in spite of some pretty grueling medical things going on. And so I wanted to, it seemed a bit that he had been able to psychologically relocate the loss. And so I was trying to find an expression with this poem. It's called Respiration in 100 Words or Less. Breathing, heard through a thread of cancer cells, might sound like the wind blowing through a hollow reed. Or maybe the pale gray whisper of your grandfather's ghost, or the rustling of snow-white taffeta from your mother's first wedding dress. When myriad tiny sacks empty and fill, it might feel like your two sons, their hands when they were babies, their tiny fingers clutching, releasing, then squeezing again. Air whistles in and out. Two balloons, a red and blue. Network of capillaries. The body becomes a wind instrument, teaching a different kind of music. So we have just a few more minutes. I wanted to leave time for questions and answers. And yes. Uh-huh. It's called he's talking about when you're looking at, and that's a great question. You're talking, and there's something called a caesura. It's which means pause. Caesura is a caesura, and it is a poetic device. It's a way of slowing the reader down. It's a way of basically, anytime you see more white space, you're going to the reader will naturally slow down. So it's just a device. And then also when you want to, the other thing you can do, and you said you saw it, and was it after the news that you looked at it? Yeah, I know this dance, the one where everyone sings. Yeah. I'm literally trying to slow down, but also reflect the interior thought process of observing a person who is grieving. You know they're grieving, but you're like, and you're also identifying with it. You're like, oh, I know this dance, because we've all done that dance. We've all done that, oh, I'm so strong, right? When we're grieving, we've all done that, and yet you just feel like you're going to crumble on the inside. So it's called a caesura. Yeah. You can also slow a reader down if you're writing poetry, depending on how much you compress the lines or don't compress the lines. So, for example, you're going to tend to read, look at Ginsberg's work. His work is moving very quickly, okay? You see you have long line lengths, right? I mean, he's going all the way, it's almost reading like prose. It's going back and forth, and it's really beautifully capturing what's going on with him, which is this almost manic frustration of, where is my mother? So it has a really different character here. So you're going to be reading, because you don't have these abrupt, you don't have line stops that are short. So when if you're writing your own poetry, or when you're reading it, the shorter the line, the more meditative and the slower you will tend to read it. And then also, too, if you have more stops after the line, or spaces, I should say, then you're going to be reading a little bit more quickly. So it's just a way of that you can control. You're controlling what the reader, and you also can be reflecting or highlight something or reflect your own inner thought process. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? Thoughts? Mm-hmm.
Slow down, but how do you practice reading? Because your tone, and when you read a poem, really portrays this. Have you read them over and over again to get your own cadence? Or is there something that you do specifically when you read out loud?
That's a very good question. I almost never read a poem out loud unless I'm asked to in a workshop or something. Sometimes when we're workshopping things, we might do that. That I'm trying to take when you're reading, one of the first things is don't go too fast, because poetry really is about savoring language in a way that prose, you can read prose more quickly, and your audience is going to kind of stay with you. Poetry, because it does lend itself to abstraction, you need to give the mind a chance to register what you've just said. So even with Ginsberg's piece, even though I know that he has these long lines, and you're going to naturally tend to read a little bit faster, but I have to tell myself, don't go too fast, because there's some amazing things in here, and I don't want you to lose, for example, "Gone without corsets and eyes." I mean, that's a great image. Her corset, he's talking about his mother's corset, and the eyes, he's got a double impact there on the eyes. The eyes are the little things that are in the corset that she laces. The little, they're like little things you're running if you wear sneakers, you have them too. It's the thing you run the lace through. But he's also talking about her eyes, these eyes here. So, you don't want, you're reading fast, but you don't want to go so fast that that the listener is not catching it. Now notice I did bring in copies of these poems because it's easier for me if I can show you copies of them. And you can see, so I know you're not going to lose it. So I will probably read a little faster than I would if you were just an audience who didn't have the poems. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then, generally speaking, the poet wants you to pause at the end of a line, even if it's not, even if the line isn't jammed. We say that the line isn't jammed if it doesn't have a period or a exclamation mark. It doesn't end as a sentence. The enjambment is where the poet is carrying you into the next line. And that's usually pretty deliberate. And that is something very consistent with modern poetry. Not exclusive to modern poetry, but you see more of it in modern poetry, where you're going to see a line wrap, go into the next line. And sometimes a poet will kind of play with you and do something a little unexpected there, or throw in a word you don't really expect to see in that next line. So that's another device that you can use. That's a great question. Thanks. Okay, I have time for maybe one more question, if anybody has one. Okay. Well, I'll be here for a few minutes. If you have any questions for me afterwards, feel free to come up. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. I really enjoyed my time with you. Thank you.